Hi, my name is Mel, and while I do concentrate mostly on ICT subjects and cybersecurity subjects, I do science and other subjects. I also am an atheist and occasionally will do content related to religious or other claims that interest me, I guess. So look, I'm doing this particular video about examining C.S.Lewis's famous trilemma about Jesus, exploring alternative hypothesis. So C.S. Lewis' famous trilemma is that Jesus is either a Lord, as in the Son of God, a liar, as in he was fibbing, or a lunatic. And since, Jesus couldn't have been a liar or a lunatic, then he had to be who he said he was, the Son of God or whatever. That's the trilemma. So I'm going to explore some alternative hypotheses, including it could have been another L, legend, and discuss broader perspectives surrounding the analysis of Lewis, all right? So we will begin today by understanding Lewis's trilemma and its influence. Then we'll critically examine its assumptions and explore the legend hypothesis. Then we will consider some scholarly critiques, philosophical limitations, and cultural influences, and alternative explanatory models, followed by modern apologetic responses and a summary of ongoing debates. So Lewis's trilemma presents three exclusive options regarding Jesus' identity. Either he was a Lord, a liar, or a lunatic. This section introduces Lewis's argument structure, his rationale and intent, and how his trilemma has influenced Christian apologetics. And as I said, I'm an atheist, but I was born into a Christian family, was a Christian for 35, I think 6 years maybe. Anyway, and I eventually had to start looking at Christianity very seriously and look, I could no longer become convinced that there was one God or two, that Jesus was, the Son of God. I'm even of the opinion now that I don't believe that Jesus existed as a real person. Like, I'm not 100% confident of that, obviously. Look, obviously there's a lot of room for doubt. I'm fine with people saying that there was based on someone, but look, I have not been convinced that there is a real person behind all the stories, at least. I'm not convinced. I don't believe it, in other words. But look, that's not my sort of like saying, when I'm saying the legend, even if there was a real personal person, like this was based on, he was certainly highly mythologized. And I think that goes without saying. So look, I could sit here and say I believe Jesus existed. I don't. But if people want to believe he did, then I don't care. To me, it's an unimportant question. I'm just not convinced by his existence, but I'm not going to say 100% or even anything, probably over 55, 60% that he didn't exist. I'm just thinking on the balance of the probabilities, no, but it's not important to this argument, all right? What's important is I don't think that if there was a real person, that he was the Son of God or even a prophet or anything of the kind, okay? So, and I'm this is what we're talking about here. Lewis argued that Jesus' claims about himself leave only three logical options: divine, Lord, deceitful liar, or deluded lunatic. Now, I want to just say here that nothing in the Bible or even in the extra biblical apocryphal stuff has been written or claimed to have been written by Jesus. All right. So we don't know what he did or did not, if he existed, actually claimed about himself, because all we've got is at best third or fourth person's second-hand recording of an event that, like even Paul, who was one of the first writers, never actually met Jesus. He said so himself. He said he got it from scripture, which he meant the Hebrew texts that were around, and from Revelation, which he meant dreams and hallucinations. He said so, and he said that Peter, who he met, and anyone else he met, got their information the same way. So look, from assuming that, well, look, either, and Paul even, if there was a real person, Paul wrote in the 50s sometime, maybe late 50s, I'm not, CE. But, certainly Mark, which was written of the first of the New Testament, as in the Gospels, first Gospels, Mark was written first, and probably not till about the 70s. Matthew sometimes later, like maybe 80s. Luke sometime later again. 90s, and John not until, 110 or so. And then, like everything else, a lot of letters of Paul's aren't even genuine. Only, I think, 6 or 7 of them are, from memory. So, look, at best, we don't have anything that Jesus might have actually said, because none of this stuff, anything those people wrote, they were probably oral stories passed around about something, but we don't know what. John the Baptist certainly existed. We do know that. But was this figure of Jesus fashioned after him? Was there a real Jesus? Who knows? So the argument that Lewis gives is designed to challenge the common perception of Jesus as merely a moral teacher. And look, I'm going to say something here again. Look, I understand that a lot of people do think that Jesus, if they're, may have been a moral teacher or a good person. And look, at least some of the stories that relate to him do paint him in that light, but others paint him as not too moral at all. And look, I don't want to sort of sit here and just bash Christianity or bash Jesus, because it doesn't matter to me. But I understand this is very precious to a lot of people. And so all I'm saying is, look, the perception or thinking that Jesus is a moral teacher is not a perception that everybody shares, all right? Because certainly I've come to look through at least some of the stuff that has been assigned to Jesus, whether he said them or not, or did them or not, who knows, that it wasn't really all that moral. It wasn't all that good. And that's not because I just hate Christianity or hate God or hate Jesus. I don't. My mother, who's still alive, is Christian. My father was a Uniting Church minister. And I don't hate any gods. I just don't believe they exist. There's a very big difference there. So, look, I think, C.S.Lewis was writing in a time when a lot of people would have thought Jesus was a moral teacher. And he's trying to challenge that common perception of Jesus just being a moral teacher. So he's just trying to say either, he was a divine lord, a deceitful liar, or a deluded lunatic. And so I guess that's where Lewis is dead now, and C.S.Lewis was, not an easy man, I don't think. But I think he was trying to sort of say, for people of his time, that this is the challenge, you've got to face. And I think, Lewis didn't stop to think this through, maybe. Lewis was a very smart man. I'm not saying he was silly at all. And I don't believe Christians are silly or deluded. I believe anyone who believes in God is silly or deluded or stupid or ignorant. That's just not true. There's very many reasons why people might believe in a God or, whatever. And I actually don't really care about this, only that this sort of stuff comes up again and again to people like me who are atheists. And, I think this is just the only reason why I'm, talking about it now. Lewis intended to defend Christian faith by clarifying Jesus' identity. So he didn't want people he wanted to defend the faith. So that is what apologists of any religion do, is defend their faith. Now, look, the cynic in me would say that if there really is some kind of a God or gods, and it had anything to do with us at all, and had anything to do with the influencing of any of these scriptures, of any religion, then I wouldn't have done such an appallingly bad job. I mean, I'm sorry, but look, I know a lot of people really value their religious scriptures, and I'm fine with them doing that, but as long as they're fine with me not doing that. And then it comes to me for having to say, look, I don't accept it. And even me just saying, look, let's make a secular government so that religion, whatever you believe, it's neutral to everybody, including atheists, because secularism is not necessarily atheism, all right? So the trilemma had become a foundational argument in modern Christian apologetics, often cited to support the divinity of Jesus, shaping debates and discussions in religious and academic contexts. And look, I don't know that it still shapes. I've seen it around still, but not as much. And I think that's because a lot more people know a lot more about how and when these different books of the Bible were written and how they came to be included in the Bible. So I think, look, it is still around, which is why I'm responding to it, obviously. So, look, how much it does, I don't know. You'd have to talk to religious people, but yeah. So this section analyses key assumptions underlying the trilemma, including the authenticity of Jesus' recorded claims. And I'll just say here, well, what's been recorded as Jesus' claims, we don't know that Jesus said them again, because none of the New Testament, all of it was written decades later of any person, if they existed. So we don't know if if there was a personal person, if this person said anything of the kind or did anything of the kind. This is a problem. I think the historical context of gospel authorship and alternative scriptural interpretations. And look, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, they're just names assigned to the four Gospels. They don't actually know who wrote them, right? The originals had no names on them. So they might have just put names on them who, yeah, what's your name, Mark? Okay, good. Look, we don't know who wrote them. And that's the thing here, is they are actually just the names that were assigned them. We don't know why. And a lot of Christians will try and fight this question to the death, but most reputable scholars, even Christian ones, will say no, they don't know who wrote them. So the question of reliability and interpretation of Jesus' supposed self-referential claims, noting variations in gospel accounts and considering how these impact the trilemma's validity. Yeah, I think considering what we do know of gospel authorship, which is nothing, and we know when they were written, then I don't think that we can say that anything said about what this figure of Jesus said or did, if they existed, is at all verifiable. I mean, I don't think it can be at all. I don't know how they even judge that. I mean, I think, look, obviously some people do judge that, but I mean, I would be thinking that, look, honestly, it can't be all that reliable in my thing, look, I just don't think. So, look, understanding the cultural, political, and religious context of first century Judea and the authorship of the Gospel highlights the complexities that challenge the trilemma's straightforward assumptions. Yeah, look, for sure. And that and others. Look, I mean, I'm going to say that even if we for sure knew that a guy named Yeshua, because his name would not have been Jesus in Aramaic, for goodness sake, but okay, if a guy who existed, Yeshua or Jesus, if you prefer, did exist, and they wrote, we know for sure who the gospel authors were, and they wrote things down that we could date back to, Jesus's being there or whatever. Would we therefore be regarded as saying what they wrote is therefore true? Because, like, all the stories got is Jesus being the son of a carpenter, or, not, I guess, a biological son, although that's a bit sort of weird, but anyway, that they probably would not have been literate. So if you've got scribes writing down what he's going to say, how would he know? I mean, scribes would have been putting stuff down to, because they want to sell this to people, like sell the religion. I don't mean that in a nasty way. I mean, they're trying to get converts for the coming kingdom, supposedly. They want to make it sound good. So, I mean, I don't know that we would even, certainly the supernatural claims would have to come under question, even if we knew everything else for sure. There's no way that anyone, you'd be going, like, are they just seeing something they don't understand? Are they playing it up? Who knows? I mean, that's the problem. Scriptural texts can be interpreted metaphorically, well, they certainly can be, and frequently are, or symbolically, and that too, which opens possibilities beyond the trilemma's rigid categories, and, well, of course it does, and invites broader theological reflection, yes. The legend hypothesis suggests that the stories of Jesus evolved over time, and there's definitely evidence of that. If you start off at Paul's story, there's no mention of a bloody tomb. There's no mention of a hell of a lot of stuff in Paul's, original 7 letters, I think it is. And like Mark's stories, the original Mark ended where the women ran away from the empty tomb, and that was it. So you can see from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John that the story just grew legs, right? You can see more mythological stuff being poured over this as we go along. So I think that's just obvious. The hypothesis proposes that the Jesus figure was gradually mythologized through oral tradition and cultural storytelling. Yeah, for sure. Look, even if there was a real personal persons, then the figure was obviously mythologized through oral tradition and cultural storytelling, resulting in the layered narratives present in the Gospels. Look, you just have to read the Gospels with a halfway skeptical mind, and that's very clearly obvious. And look, if you take it then that, these, Gospels were written some time after, they don't know who wrote them, then it's just obvious that this is like very... It's sort of the fish story got bigger every time, Ancient cultures frequently blended history and myth, and they did, like the Greeks and the Romans did it all the time. And look, the original New Testament was written in Greek, And like for anyone to become like fluent in Greek, they had to would have gone through stories about Odysseus and all those stories, as well as Roman stories. So they would have understood um, the the art of the telling the story. And there are people, look, I do see something in this that there's a scholar, Dennis MacDonald, I think, who does think that a lot of what's in the Gospels was probably, lifted, or syncretized from Greek stories. And there's some, I think, look, I've heard a lot of evidence surrounding it, so I'm sort of on board with it. He thinks Jesus existed. I don't particularly, but look, understanding myth foundation helps contextualize how Jesus' story may have incorporated symbolic themes and legendary motifs. Yeah, look, and look, for sure, like we got one stories in one of the Gospels where Jesus is walking along with his disciples and sees a fig tree, and it's not serving figs, but it's not the season for figs, right? So he goes, I'm going to curse you, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes to the Jewish temple and blah, 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 comes out. And then the next day they see the tree has died and withered. Now, nobody believes, hopefully, that Jesus actually cursed a fig tree. It's a symbolic thing to say that the temple era of the Jews is over and done with, because in 70 CE, the Romans flattened the joint. So it's a way of their dealing with a very traumatic, probably cultural thing that happened, because obviously there were some Jewish Christians around. Why, who knows? But, look, so the interplay between oral transmission and early documentary sources contribute to the evolution of Jesus' story. And look, a lot of Jesus' story does also look at it retells in different ways the Moses myth and the famous Joseph myth, and it retells Jesus' story as Elijah and Elisha complicating claims of direct historical accuracy. I don't think you could say much of anything at all in the Bible is directly historically accurate. I mean, it's not saying there aren't bits and pieces here and there, but certainly most of it at best is cultural mythology and storytelling meant to give rise to an identity. I mean, and I think, look, I was never one of the Christians when I was a Christian that believed literally in the absolute, literature of the Bible. I mean, because, who would believe that? But I know there are some Christians who do. But look, I'm not a Christian now anyway, but I think to try and say that every single word of the Bible must be, it's inerrant, it's absolutely what did happen. It's not a position that is sensible or even reasonably defended. And look, I think even if there was a person or persons behind all of this, which, as again, I'm saying I don't think there was, but look, if there was, okay, I really don't care. Obviously, a lot of the details were tacked on because there was they were trying to get certain points across with what they were writing. They were trying to tell moral stories or cultural stories. They were trying to get, things, pretty much in a world where maybe 5% of the population were literate, if that. They were, you would engage people's attention with, you would tell maybe a little bit of truth in an oral story. You'd also teach cultural and spiritual and other sort of stories, There's This section reviews a critique of the trilemma and explores alternative theories on Jesus' identity, including views of him as a misunderstood historical figure and comparison with other religious leaders. Some scholars argue that Jesus was a historical person whose teachings and actions were later misinterpreted or exaggerated, providing nuance beyond the trilemma's options. Yeah, and obviously that is something that could have, and it's probably in more ways than one, happened, whether there was a real person or not. They argue if he was historical, but I think, and it's really difficult too, because there were a lot of people, because the name Jesus would translate today probably as Joshua, all right? And I think that there would have been quite a lot of Joshuas, born around that might have gone around and done enough to piss the Romans off to get crucified, Historical records and textual analysis suggest that some gospel elements are later additions and embellishments, which complicates the trilemma's premise of what are Jesus' supposed claims, or claims about him, at least anyway. Comparing Jesus to other religious founders highlights common patterns in how stories and identities can evolve, questioning the uniqueness implied by the trilemma. Here we identify logical fallacies in Lewis's reasoning, such as false dichotomies, and discuss the broader spectrum of possible explanations excluded by the trilemma. The trilemma limits options to three extremes, ignoring many other plausible explanations that neither label Jesus as a divine Lord, a liar, nor lunatic, thereby oversimplifying a complex issue. And look, and if there was a person or persons, there's no reason why they can't have been partly a liar or partly lunatic. Because, anyone going up, trying to piss the Romans off, thinking that, trying to even just do the right thing, maybe, who knows, is probably not all that, probably has got some issues there going on. But look, he's trying to oversimplify something that's very complex. Logical fallacies such as the false dilemma weaken the force of the trilemma, making it less convincing as an argument for Jesus' divinity or other identities. Recognising a range of interpretations from metaphorical to historical to theological provides a more nuanced understanding than the rigid trilemma allows. This section explores how first century Judaism, Hellenistic culture, early Christian community, and transmission processes shaped the gospel narratives about Jesus. The religious and cultural environment of the time influenced how the Jesus story was told and interpreted, blending Jewish traditions with Greco-Roman elements. Yeah, and I've said that before too. Look, and that definitely is what happened. Different early Christian groups contributed varying perspectives and emphasis in gospel writings, impacting the development of Jesus' portrayal. And look, there were many in very early Christianity, for sure, there were very many vastly different Christianity groups around, and they were in competition with each other a lot of the time. They didn't like each other some of the time, and there were even early Christians that did believe that Jesus wasn't a real person at all, that all of this happened in some other realm or something. I mean, like, that's wild. So, I mean, I think that a lot of people, because like the Jews were not a uniform group back then or now. There were many different type of Jewish groups, and there were some who did believe in resurrection of the dead, some believed in different things. And so I think we'd make the mistake of thinking that, the Jews were all this homogeneous, single solid lot, and they just weren't. I mean, that's not where the thinking is. The oral nature of early Christian storytelling obviously led to adaptations and transformations, which complicate efforts to discern if there are any historical facts from theological messages. Yep, for sure. We consider other things beyond the traditional trilemma, including Jesus as a prophet, symbolic figure, socio-political actor, broadening our understanding of his identity, if there was even one. And look, as I said, he could have just been like, around the first century Judea, there are an awful lot of Jews who were sick and tired of the Roman occupation and crap all that they'd had a lot of different, occupations over the time. They were sick to death of it. And they were causing trouble, which you can't sort of really blame them, but, a lot of them going, the prophet, or Messiah is going to come and deliver us and get all these horrible, people. So, look, I mean, Jesus's story, whether there was a person or not, it's certainly not unique. There would have been a lot of people, running around. John the Baptist, he was hardly sane. And a lot of them, not just them, to a lot of Jewish reactionary figures, and you can't really blame them. I'm just saying the story of Jesus would have been one that would have been repeated quite, unfortunately, a few times. And whether or not there was a real person or not, I don't even think is the point, So, look, there are some people who do and have viewed Jesus as a moral teacher, or either as a prophet, like most Muslims think he's a prophet, distinct from any divine status or deception, highlighting his impact on the world. Look, and that's for sure. I mean, look, there's many people would say that, they might think he was hopefully a moral teacher or a prophet or anything else, So you don't. I think that that certainly the stories told about him, at least some of them do represent him as a moral teacher. Not all of them do, but I'm not going to go there. Interpreting Jesus's teachings or supposed teachings symbolically allows for diverse spiritual meanings that can transcend literalist readings and rigid classifications. And I think it also does help that not to take everything so literal, because I think you're missing, the forest for the trees. I think, like, when I was, Christian, certainly, obviously believed Jesus was the Son of God because I was Christian, but when I, become atheist and looked a lot more into this, I realised how a lot of the stories that are in the Gospels, I didn't sort of see the significance of them or what they were really trying to say, because you sort of you had blinkers on. And like as I said, the story about Jesus withering the fig tree. I mean, Jesus, obviously, if there was a guy, he didn't really go out and wither a fig tree. But it was about how the era of the temple religion and the temple Judaism had finished because Jesus burnt the place down. I mean, like, it was trying to sort of saying, look, they, and that was interpreted as being some, God was angry or something. I don't know. But I mean, I think there's a lot of other sort of moral messages they're trying to, like a lot of other things that they were trying to communicate with those stories that did not actually happen, right? And I think that, like, more fundamentalist Christians who insist on this being the actual literal word of any God are missing out on the genuine, like, how a group in civilization, a group of people, different groups of people, because it wasn't just one, because there was many different Christianities that existed, that, how they were trying, and they were Jewish Christians, they were trying to make sense of a world that, wasn't making sense to them. They were trying to sort of embrace each other and hold each other up to be faithful to their God, I guess, in a way. I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, understanding, Jesus within the socio-political context of his alleged time or through sort of psychological frameworks can provide alternative explanations for what is written in the Gospels, at least, anyway. This section outlines how contemporary Christian scholars have revised or defended the trilemma, as well as responses from secular and interfaith perspectives. Some modern apologists seek more nuanced or expanded versions of the trilemma. Yeah, I'm sure they do. Attempting to address criticisms and strengthen their arguments. That, look, if there was a God or gods, there shouldn't be any need for apologists. I think saying that there are apologists around for any religion says that those religions can't be true, but that's just me. Christian scholars often reinforce the trilemma's core message while acknowledging complexities, aiming to uphold faith through scholarship and dialogue. And look, this, depending on the Christian scholar, I mean, like, my father was a scholar, but he was very honest about, like, he studied, like, and he was very, very honest about the Bible and all its bits and pieces, probably too honest, because then I could no longer believe in. I mean, look, I don't want to out my father or my mother here, so I'm not going to say anything else, but, I think most, like, progressive Christian scholars at least will admit that the trilemma is just not, like, you really, scholarship alone cannot provide faith. I don't think it, I mean, if anyone thinks it can, or reading of any religious text can't just be faith, no, it's not. I mean, faith, I think, is useless too. You shouldn't need faith, and I don't know why it's held to be such a good thing, but anyway. Critics from secular and other religious traditions challenge the trilemma's assumptions and propose alternative interpretations of who Jesus may or may not have been and whatever legacy there is. And as I said, Muslims and others think that he was a prophet, others think he was just a very good moral teacher, others think he was maybe a good man, maybe others think he was just probably some poor ass who got himself nailed to a cross because the Romans probably didn't like Jews a whole lot in the time. I mean, look, there's many different perspectives, So we conclude today by examining and summarising the current historical consensus. And I'm just going to say, look, the historical consensus is that Jesus existed. I don't agree with that consensus for reasons I don't really want to go too much in. But, look, I'll just say, look, the consensus of whom is probably going to ask, because that's a big question here. And look, there are a lot of increasingly numbers of secular Bible scholars, but a lot of them are at universities that will at least sign something saying they won't challenge whether Jesus existed or not, or won't outwardly challenge much in the way of like the faith. They might say, look, I don't believe, but whatever. But look, I think very least, look, I can acknowledge that the current consensus is that there was a person, right? There is definitely, look, the Christian consensus is that Jesus was the Son of God. That's obviously not the consensus held by all Bible scholars or even all religious scholars. So, and I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm in cybersecurity. I've read the Bible, I've read the Quran, I've read the parts of the Jewish Talmud, and I've read Bhagavad Gita, I've read the Mormon book. I mean, I've read a few different ones, and okay, I can't honestly tell you that I find a lot of difference between them, but I don't want to be offensive, but I mean, I am speaking as an atheist, so you take what you get. But anyway, thank you for your time.